Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are returning to the summer of 2009, often referred to as Dark Strike Fighter format, and talking about a deck that didn't really become popular until the latter stages of the format. When most people think about this format, and especially going into Nationals that year, I can remember this very vividly, there were really four top decks. There was Black Wings, Light Sworns, Gladiator Beasts, and Cat Synchro. We've already profiled Cat Synchro, and we've technically profiled Glads, though not this particular version of Glads with one Bestiari. But heading into Nationals, those are really the top four decks on everyone's mind. And if you look at the top 64, that obviously played out. We had Cat Synchro winning. We had Cat Synchro defeating Gladiator Beasts in the top two. We had plenty of other decks like Light Sworns and Black Wings that had a lot of success. So heading into Nationals, the expectations about the top four decks really played out. What surprised a lot of people, though, was that Adam Corney, a very well-known player at the time, was able to top 64 with a deck that was off the radar, known as Salvo-DAD. Salvo-DAD was a deck that combined the combination of Black Salvo and Dekoichi the Battle Enchanted Locomotive to access powerful level 7s out of the extra deck, especially Dark Strike Fighter, but of course also Black Rose Dragon, with a very small Destiny Hero package, which is a little bit surprising because at this point, we had just the remnants left of old Dad Return and old, not even Teledad decks, but sort of old Synchro-based Dark Arm decks. I'm talking about the fact that there was only one Dark Arm, one Return. There were Destiny Heroes, but Malicious was at 2, Disc had been banned, Dark Magician of Chaos had been long banned. So we're talking about a very limited supply of the old Dark Arm D-Hero strategies. But we combine those two together. So we have Dekoichi plus Black Salvo, small D-Hero package, a small sort of return package with Cyber Valley plus one return. And we actually put together a cohesive deck that saw a fair bit of success at the end of the format. Adam ended up top 64ing the US Nationals, but then 3 of these Black Salvo decks ended up topping the final Shonen Jump of the season in Indianapolis, which is where we're going to profile Black Salvo. We're specifically going to look at Adam's Salvo-DAD deck from the Indianapolis SJC. I've only tweaked 3 cards in the side deck, and I'll comment on those changes when I get into the deck profile. But other than that, it is almost a carbon copy of the deck that he used at the very final Shonen Jump of the format. And when we think about this format, and certainly at the time, if we consider there have been 4 top decks, if we add Salvo-DAD as a reasonable 5th top deck, and we go into a top 16, in theory, if the format was equally dispersed, each of them would get 3 spots, plus one sort of floating, right? The final Shonen Jump of the format, there were 3 Salvo-DAD decks, which could suggest the possibility that if this format progressed, Salvo-DAD in retrospect may be considered on the level of those other 4. I actually wouldn't personally quite put it on that level. I think it was a little bit below, maybe tier 1.5. I think it had some limitations, and I would have preferred to run Cat Synchro at the time. But it was absolutely a deck that by the end of the format was getting more popular, had a lot of steam behind it, had a lot of top players using it. I vividly remember a tournament that took place in Massachusetts. It was a 1K tournament that ended up just being a PlayStation 4 tournament. The amount of players ended up being way below what it needed to be. But I remember Jerry Wang, another top player at the time, showed up to that event with Salvo-DAD. So by the end of the format, a lot of top players, whether it was Adam Korn or Jerry Wang, were on Salvo-DAD. And if the format continued, as I alluded to a few moments ago, I think that deck would have continued to see popularity, continued to see play, and probably would have continued to be successful.
All right, we'll start with the monsters. This deck has 3 copies of Cyber Valley. Cyber Valley combines with the 2 copies of Mind Control plus Brain Control to give you a little bit of a card advantage engine. It also combines really nicely with Scapegoats and Machine Duplication. So in terms of actual raw card advantage, Cyber Valley accomplishes quite a bit. You know, it's also, if your opponent doesn't have their own Brain Control or Mind Control, the type of card that you could summon and pass. As I just alluded to, though, there is some risk. Their opponent just steals it and then vanishes to draw 2. So something to take into consideration. You also technically have return from the different dimensions. So some of the more powerful things that this deck can accomplish revolve around using Cyber Valley and getting the draw 2 effect off multiple times. Then we have the Black Salvo engine. So this deck is called, obviously, Salvo-DAD. There's 2 copies of Black Salvo and then 2 copies of Dekoichi the Battle Enchanted Locomotive. Dekoichi is the only target for Black Salvo in this deck, but once you get one Dekoichi into the graveyard, every Black Salvo that you draw allows you to put a level 3 tuner and then a Dekoichi on the field, which from there obviously allows you to go into the extra deck, accessing things like Black Rose, and then often if you're going for game, Dark Strike Fighter, right? This is Dark Strike Fighter format. Level 7 is really the go-to level out of the extra deck when we're trying to win the game, and Black Salvo plus Dekoichi allows you to do that. It's also technically a crush card target, right? 1,000 or less attack. It has only 100. It is a dark, so you theoretically could just crush guard this away. Or even, summon it, get this. Maybe you don't want to go into Black Rose or Dark Strike or any of the other level 7s, and you could just crush guard it. So that is the Salvo part of the deck. Then we have the Destiny Hero part of the deck, which is actually pretty small. At this point in time, Malicious was limited to 2, so you can only run 2 copies of Malicious. Malicious also combines really well with Cyber Valley. One of the sort of classic opening turns is to Destiny draw Malicious, banish to get your second, and then summon Cyber Valley to draw 2. Right, so you just filter through 4 cards by getting the 2 off Cyber Valley and the 2 off Destiny draw. It costs you Destiny draw, Malicious, and 1 Valley, so you do go +1 from that interaction. Very, very, very common interaction throughout the time period that Malicious and Cyber Valley were legal, and it doesn't hurt as bad to do that because there's only 2 Malicious. If there were 3 Malicious in the format, if you were to do that, you would actually strand the 3rd Malicious in your deck, but with just 2 Malicious, it's actually a pretty optimal use of Malicious. Then we have 1 single Plasma and, of course, the single copy of Stratos. At this point in time, Disc Commander's banned, so we have recursion cards in our deck like Reborn, but obviously we can't summon Disc Commander. Dasher's not very good. The only Destiny hero that might warrant a consideration is Diamond Dude, but even that is not really all that great. There were versions of this deck that did run Diamond Dude. I think partially because with only 3 Destiny heroes and only 2 that you would actually want to Destiny draw, it's really hard to actually use Destiny draw, assuming you end up drawing into more than 1. Drawing into 1, because you have Rhoda and Stratos and the double Malicious and Plasma, it's likely that you can resolve 1 Destiny draw. If the game goes too long, that second Destiny draw is reasonable chance that it just gets stranded in hand. A little frustrating, but with a small Destiny hero package, it is a concession that you have to make, that there is a possibility you draw dead Destiny draws as the game progresses. But the upside is still there, right? Destiny draw, Cyber Valley, Malicious, that combination is really good. Stratos plus D draw is always really good. So there are plenty of reasons to run the Destiny heroes, but the package is actually really small. No Plasma, nothing beyond Plasma and Malicious. No Dasher, no Diamond Dude, and then Disc Commander is banned. So that is it. The next sort of engine I'm going to call the Mystic Tomato engine, where we have single copy of Tomato, Sanguine, and then Plague Spreader Zombie. Plague Spreader Zombie is our primary way of accessing level 8s and level 6s out of the extra deck. So combining with obviously Stratos, Koichi, Tomato himself, Dark Refer technically, you can go into things like Goyo Guardian, which is the powerful level 6. Access to Plague Spreader also allows you to use Malicious to go into level 8s, which was really common. This format was after Salvo-DAD format, where Malicious plus a level 2 tuner was a primary method of going into the extra deck, accessing things like Colossal and Stardust Dragon. At this point in time, Krebons is at 3, but Emergency Teleport's at 1. You could justify maybe including that package. Some versions of decks in and around this time period that still wanted to run the Destiny heroes would do that. But Plague Spreader was simply enough, right? The Black Salvo himself is going to give you access to the extra deck, although level 7s, not level 8s. So just having Plague Spreader is still good because it gives you the Greffer interaction, where you can go Dark Greffer, discard Malicious, and Plague, and then all of a sudden you have access to level 8, or sort of vice versa. Plague Spreader is also really good because if you happen to have a Plague Spreader in the graveyard, you could theoretically put Malicious on top of your deck and then banish one from the graveyard. That sometimes happens when you drew double Malicious, so having the ability to filter your draws there is also pretty nice. I alluded to Dark Greffer. Greffer is also here because we just need reinforcements of the army targets. As you might notice here, technically we only have 2. The last 2 ones are sort of boss monsters, or one is definitely a boss monster, one is a big monster that has a lot of use in this format and Gores. But as you notice, there's only 2 warriors, right? We're not running Disc because it's banned. Diamond Dude's probably not powerful enough. It's sort of really slow. It's an easy monster for sure to attack over. And if you're just going Diamond Dude pass, your opponent's going to try and beat you pretty quick. So small Rhoda package of just having 2. As I just alluded to. A little quick on these last 2 monsters. Darkarm is obvious. We call this Salvo-DAD. It's kind of funny. Darkarm's at 1, but this deck still has that DAD attached to it. A lot of decks going forward, after DAD was limited to 1, still had that DAD, right? Skill Drain DAD, in reference to the deck that Jeff Jones used when he came back. Really, when YCSs came back, or Shonen Jumps came back in Anaheim when Konami took over. He called it Skill Drain DAD. It had 1 DAD in it. So during this period of time, a lot of decks, dark-based decks with Allure and Destiny heroes, had that DAD attached to them. Nevertheless, we have the Darkarm Dragon, and then Gores is an important piece in this particular format. If you've watched any of my recent videos, whether it's the deck profile or the match, you saw Synchro Cat can win out of nowhere. The Synchro Cat player always needs to consider the likelihood of the opponent having Gores, and even the threat of Gores makes it so that the opponent has to compensate, make plays early on in the game to chip away damage, to make it so that Gores isn't actually a method of stopping a Synchro Cat play. But nevertheless, Gore is really important, can slow down, all of the very aggressive decks that exist in this time period. And you do want some outs in game 1. to your opponent just sort of going off. It's not great against GBs. It has some weaknesses, but it's really sort of an important piece against decks like Synchro Cat. The spells, we have double Mind Control. Mind Control is at 3 this format. It would be limited to 1 at the end of the format. Mind Control, one of the most powerful cards in this format. Obviously, it combines really well with tuners, and we have both a level 2 and a level 3 tuner, so we can sort of manipulate as we need. We also play triple Cyber Valley, so the ability to take a set monster, which is something Brain Control can't do. And this is a format with a lot of set monsters, whether it's Raikou out of the Lightsworn deck or out of the Synchro Cat deck, Spy and Guard out of the Synchro Cat deck. We are going to be taking set monsters, so taking a set monster, maybe getting a flip effect like Raikou, or at least ridding your opponent from getting off their Cyber, or rather their Gravekeeper Spy effect, and then banishing it with Cyber Valley. Mind Control, really fantastic card. Adam elected to run 2 copies of Gold Sarcophagus. That's an interesting one because, people think of this format as a format where the games are pretty condensed, just a couple turns, and I think if you see Synchro Cat open a really ideal hand, you might have that impression, but as was the case in the second game that I played against Sean, some of the games can go a little bit. And a card like Gold Sarcophagus is useful because there are some really powerful cards in this format that if you get access to, specifically Crush Card Virus, there are certain matchups where this card can just totally shift the game in your favor. Blackwings is a good example of that. They might have all the Whirlwinds going, but if you Crush Card them and hit their Shuras and Boras and maybe on-field Armor Masters, it can be really devastating. So being able to search out Crush Card Virus is really good. Being able to search out a card like Heavy Storm when you need it, Monster Reborn, Reinforcements of the Army, etc. There is some application where Gold Sarc, because this deck specifically runs Threatening Roar as well, you might actually have the game pass those 2 turns and actually use Gold Sarc for its intended purpose. It's just sort of funny to think that because when you look at Gold Sarc in a modern context, it's sort of a card that just tutors something out that you get access to immediately. If you're thinking about the Flunder deck or some of the other types of decks that have used this, Thunder Dragons. No, we are using Gold Sarc for most often its intended purpose in this deck. We are going to wait 2 turns and get our card. The only sort of outlier there is if we have Return Set, which is always an interaction you need to be aware of, that if you have this, you can tutor out any monster and then return it immediately. But besides that one interaction, cheating something out quickly through return, we are using Gold Sarc to search Duplication, to search Heavy Storm, Reborn, Crush Cards, stuff like that. Then, as I alluded to, we have 2 copies of Destiny Draw. We only have 3 Destiny Heroes in the deck. So we have a pretty limited Destiny Hero package. As a result, we only have 2 Destiny Draws. Allure of Darkness was limited to 2, or else we would certainly run 3. So we have 2 Allure of Darknesses. These 4 cards give us sort of the consistency and draw power. Basically, the entire deck is dark. I think the entire deck is dark. There might be a couple lights, I guess, with Cyber Valley. But besides Cyber Valley and Stratos, the entire deck is dark. So Allure is fantastic. And if you have Stratos, you just search a dark monster. Then sort of the power one-ofs, Reborn. I know I forgot to put this in the Synchro Cat deck the other day because I took this Reborn out of the deck and almost put it in a modern deck. And I've left it here as it should have been in the Synchro Cat deck. So Monster Reborn, Brain Control, which is a little redundant with Mind Control, but it's a little bit better in most conditions. Sometimes if your opponent doesn't actually beat you with their Dark Strike play or whatever it happens to be, they have to think about, do I just tribute off a bunch of monsters? Well, if you Mind Control a Dark Strike fighter, it can't be tributed. If you Mind Control Brain Control, on the other hand, totally different story. You can attack with the Dark Strike, shoot it off, all those things. So Brain Control is really useful if you stop your opponent from killing you through Gores or through Threatening Roar. The ability to attack and then tribute something off through Dark Strike Fighter is really, really useful. And then we also have Cyber Valley. Sort of the typical one-of. These are both limited to 1, Heavy Storm and MST. Really good against most decks. Not great against Lightsworn, so you could pick off with MST in the end phase a Beckoning Light. But besides that, it was basically just, a pretty easy card for your opponent to Lila away before you ever had the opportunity to do that. And besides that, that deck's not really running any traps. So a little bit of a vulnerability there, but for the most part, you want these. You want to be able to stop Black Whirlwind, which is a really frustrating card to play against. And then Heavy is just Heavy. We have Scapegoats, which synergizes with both Cyber Valley. That's the obvious one, but it also synergizes with Plasma. Having these 2 cards, when you think about Destiny Heroes, your instinct might be, ooh, D-Draw Malicious and kind of go off that way. Well, no, if you have Rhoda or Stratos plus Goats, it's actually a really good play where you just go summon Stratos, set Goats, pass. Your opponent has a difficult time beating you, right? If they go Cold Wave or they try to make a Synchro Cat play, Scapegoats does work as a way of counteracting that. Your opponent really can't clear 4 Scapegoats and deal 8,000 damage, so they have to overcompensate by going into Arcanites or do something that doesn't actually kill you. And in one sense, that obviously keeps you alive, but if your opponent leaves you with the Scapegoats, now you can tribute summon for Plasma or special summon by tributing the Scapegoats for Plasma, and that card's really difficult to deal with. It's always been difficult to deal with. There are outs to it, don't get me wrong, cards like Book of Moon, but it's still a card that's difficult to deal with. So Scapegoats has 2 cards that it's synergized with, Cyber Valley and Plasma. And then we have Machine Duplication. It sort of gives this deck one of its high upsides, which is the ability to combine Valley with Duplication. Valley with Duplication, basically you trade your normal summon and the duplication for 3 Cyber Valleys. If that is all that you have, and on the first turn I would make this play, you banish 2 Valleys, you draw 2 cards, and you have a Valley on the field. So you've basically netted out, drawn 2, used 2 cards in your hand, and you have another floating draw with the Valley. Combine Mind Control or Brain Control with that, it gets crazy because then you take an opponent's monster and then you end up drawing 2 more cards. So you end up trading Duplication, Valley, and then one of these 2, right? Mind Control or Brain Control. So you end up trading 3 cards, but you draw 4 cards and get rid of one of your opponent's monsters, so it ends up being a +2. Obviously, those are some of the highest upsides. Plus, when you do this combination with Cyber Valley, it fuels your return from the different dimension, which I know is limited to 1. You don't necessarily anticipate always having access to it, but it can happen. So it gives this deck that really high upside when combining with Cyber Valley. And you also have Sangin in your deck, Tomato, so you can search Valley when you need it. You also technically have Gold Sark, so you could search a combo piece. In terms of the trap lineup, there are a few versions of this deck. Some ran Solemn Judgment, which I don't necessarily think is a bad idea. I really like Solemn Judgment. It's a scary card in this format because of the ease of going into Dark Strike Fighter. Even if your opponent's not going Monk double spell, it's really easy just to summon Dark Strike Fighter, right? The blacking player can just go summon Shura, summon Gale, attack, main phase 2, Dark Strike Gain. And if you pay 4,000 life, which is presumably the minimal amount that you'll ever pay, it puts you into instant Dark Strike at any point. If you were at 4,000 life, 1 direct attack plus main phase 2 use of Dark Strike Fighter's effect is exactly 4,000. So you have to be very wary of using Solemn Judgment this format. As a result, I think Adam elected to run a trap lineup without Solemn Judgment and instead elected to play cards like Threatening Roar. Threatening Roar is an interesting card that saw a lot of play specifically in Lightsworns. I think it has a lot of synergy there in the sense that if you can protect your Lightsworns through Threatening Roar, it allows you to mill more cards, right? It gives you access to more end phases. So more access to end phases means more Wolves and Necro Gardeners. It fuels Beckoning Light. It fuels Judgment Dragon actually having the correct amount of Lightsworns on the grave. So it has a lot of synergy in that deck. It's actually why at that particular Nationals, I played Lightsworns. I liked having access to Necro, Gores, plus Threatening Roar. That package of, 5 or 6 cards in your deck give you a little bit of resistance against OTK heavy decks like Synchro Cat. I think in the same vein, Adam elected to run 2 Threatening Roars because from his perspective, if he has access to Dekoichi in the grave and Black Salvo, whatever your opponent does, you can just respond with Salvo, Dekoichi, Black Rose, right? Your opponent makes a big play, overextends, whatever it happens to be. And this card's obviously really good against a bunch of matchups too, because, if your opponent Geyseris you can chain this, at least stops them from using Geyseris to tag out and continue their card advantage engine. If your opponent goes summon Judgment Dragon, you can chain this and obviously at least give yourself another turn if your opponent ever makes that investment into the field. So I know it's sort of innately a negative one, but, this is a format where, yes, card advantage matters. Card advantage and card resources always matter. But having this card in a format where players could make those aggressive pushes, I think ultimately, would work out. Especially if we compare really the decision of Threatening Roar versus Solemn. Solemn's pretty good, but we're not protecting Royal Oppression or anything, which is one of the reasons why I think a card like Solemn Judgment's really good, which is something that contributed to why Blackwings would sometimes use Judgment with Oppression. We're not running Oppression here, so just 2 copies of Threatening Roar I think sort of fit that role. Then we have some just generic removal in Bottomless Trap Holes, Torrential Tribute, and Mirror Force. If we're not running Lightsworns, Mirror Force and Torrential are basically just staples in most decks. You look at Glads, you look at Blackwings, you look at all the top decks, you're going to see these cards. Bottomless was pretty popular too. It was popular in Synchro Cat. It was popular in Blackwings. Bottomless is especially good because, 1, it stops Black Whirlwind from resolving. If you can't check the attack of the Blackwing, Black Whirlwind doesn't end up searching. So if your opponent goes summon Shura, Obora, you can just respond with Bottomless. That's obviously pretty good. It's always been pretty good against Gladiator Beasts. The existence of Bottomless has always forced Gladiator Beast players to be very aware of how they use Bestiari, which at this point in time is limited to 1, right? You Bottomless the 1 Bestiari, it's gone for good. They have no access to Geyseris. You really just can't have that happen as a GB player. So just the existence of Bottomless required you to be very cautious with how you use Bestiari. And it's just good against that deck with Darius and Laquari, Geyseris, etc. It's pretty good against Lightsworns. Obviously, they can still priority Judgment Dragon's effect, but that's still not the worst trade if you have the ability to survive and your opponent can't, beyond just that 1 Judgment Dragon, kill you. Then it's good against Lila, Celestial. It's good against a bunch of monsters, Garoth, etc. So Bottomless, really just good across the board. It technically hits both Air Bellums if your opponent has to make a Rescue Cat or Summoner Monk play, right? If your opponent, they're desperate, they go Monk double spell into your one back row. When the Rescue Cat resolves after they summon the second Monk and they go double Air Bellum, thinking their board is going to be Monk, Monk, Air Bellum, Air Bellum, Bottomless hits both Air Bellums, which is obviously huge. So Bottomless, really good card. It also just stops a normal summon Air Bellum, threatening to deal damage. Then we have sort of the really power cards. These are the cards that we're trying to dig into with the draw power. Return, one of the best cards of all time. This deck might not have the really obvious synergies with Return as some of the DAD Return decks might have, but 2 Allures, Cyber Valley's enough. Cyber Valley has some interesting other effects beyond the draw effect where you can banish cards in your hand to put things on top of your deck. You could banish the Stratos in your hand to put something on top of your deck and then return, Stratos comes out, maybe you're popping back rows or searching. It has some utility there that you might not anticipate, and if you've played Cyber Valley with Return, I think you'll come aware of all of the combinations that those 2 cards can pull off. Plus, you do have Dark Arm. This isn't Dark Arm Return format where we're summoning 2 or 3 Dark Arms in one turn, so you might make a value play with Dark Arm, but that still fuels your banish pile. So Return, such a power card, has some utility. We run Gold Sark 2. And then we have the hand disruption cards. Crush card, almost always live in this deck. Sangin's the best one, but we have Malicious, we have Plague, Salvo, etc. And then Trap Dust Shoot. This format, Dust Shoot is incredible. If you're willing to, you can hold Dust Shoot, right? Your opponent goes activate Cold Wave. You go chain Dust Shoot. Take your Monk. You probably win the game off of that. It sort of depends on the rest of your cards. Sometimes you preempt Dust Shoot. Sometimes you activate it right away. Maybe if you have Threatening Roar, you're willing to just activate it right away to see, should you actually Threatening Roar a play your opponent makes as opposed to waiting. So a little bit of a discussion there, but Dust Shoot, really power card. We want to draw it as much as possible. Next, we'll do the extra deck. We need 2 copies of Dark Strike Fighter. It would be banned at the end of the format, and if you're a newer player that familiar with the errata, this card at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history has no errata, and it is at 3. You can summon it, you can go to your battle phase, you can attack, and in main phase 2, you can use its effect, meaning a single direct attack with Dark Strike Fighter plus just tributing off itself in main phase 2 is 4,000 damage, 14 from the levels times 200, and then 26 attack. 14 plus 26 is 4,000. So oftentimes you would deal a bunch of damage in a main phase 2, just shoot off all your monsters for game. It was kind of frustrating. It made you very cautious about taking damage early in the game, because even if your opponent doesn't actually get to attack you, if they just summon enough monsters, main phase 1, they can just shoot them all off, right? 1 Dark Strike Fighter is enough damage almost itself with 14 to win a game if a lot of damage was dealt early. So double Dark Strike Fighter, we are summoning it through Black Salvo primarily. I only have 1 copy of Black Rose, but this deck would run 2. You could run 2 copies. You absolutely would want to run 2 copies because of Black Salvo. We don't have Hot Avarice in this deck, unlike Cat Synchro, so we definitely want 2 copies of this. Adam elected to run 2 copies of Stardust Dragon. We're only really going into double Stardust when we normal summon Plague. Though theoretically we do have Reborn, so I can concede that point as well, and Brain/Mind Control, so I can totally concede the possibility of actually going into double Stardust Dragon. Adam also ran 2 copies of Colossal Fighter. I only have 1 copy right here, but I can also concede that, right? Colossal Fighter is really good against Light Sworns. Double Colossal was pretty good as well, so having multiple copies of Colossal Fighters useful. In terms of the other level 8s, we have Red Dragon Archfiend. Red Dragon Archfiend can sometimes break the Synchro Cat board if it's a really slow game or your opponent's sort of building up with spies and guards and Desqualas or whatever else they might set. You could sort of break the board with a Red Dragon Archfiend. So far in this, we have 2 copies of the 2 cards that I've pulled out. Level 7s, we have an Arcanite Magician, which might seem a little bit odd in the sense that this deck doesn't have sort of the traditional spellcaster that you need as the non-tuner, but we have Mind Control in the deck. We can Mind Control a spy, summon Black Salvo. We might not always want to go into one of these. We could just want to go into Arcanite Magician, right? Maybe we have a bunch of back rows and we don't want to pop our back rows. We want to just destroy our opponent's field. So we can use our Salvo plus their spy or guard. That happens every now and then, so we definitely want access to Arcanite. Another level 7 is Armor Master. So in order to summon this, we obviously need a Blackwing Tuner. At that point, Monster Reborn / Brain and Mind Control are the primary ways that we'd go into this. There were versions of this deck that would main deck a copy of Gale. It wasn't unreasonable to do that. Even decks like Cat Synchro sometimes did, because it's a dark, so it synergizes with Allure and Dad. If you go Brain or Mind Control on a Blackwing, you could actually just special summon the Gale, because now suddenly you control a Blackwing. So there were circumstances where decks like this, or Cat Synchro, would actually, I would say tech, but include a single copy of Gale for those synergies. This deck really only can go into this through Monster Reborn and other means like that of taking the opponent's Gale, which is the primary level 3 tuner out of that deck. But it is something to consider. So we do have a copy of Armor Master. We have a single copy of Goyo Guardian, because it was limited to 1. We have Gaia, which is sort of the second best level 6 at this point, at least in terms of attack strength. You could put in something like Iron Chain Dragon, but in terms of what that card actually accomplishes, I think Goyo is just better. I think Gaia, rather, is just better with a little bit more attack. We have Magical Android, which is our number 1 level 5 right at this point. Catastrophe had been released in the Dual Terminal preview, the one that's worth a lot of money, but it was not actually TCG legal. So Android is our only one that's worth running. And then Gyzarus might seem a little bit out of place, but this deck has Mind Control, Brain Control, and Monster Reborn. I don't want to be in one of those scenarios where my opponent has Bestiary in the grave and a GB on the field, and I'm sitting there with Reborn plus Mind Control, thinking to myself, wow, I could save my normal summon and pop 2 cards in my opponent's field and not have access to Gyzarus. In an extra deck where I think you actually have the space, right? I mean, we're cards like Armor Master. These 2 cards are only really there for Brain Control, Mind Control, Monster Reborn synergies, but I think it's totally warranted. So this was Adam's extra deck. Bump these both up to 2, and then you'll have 15 cards. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, plus the 5 at the bottom. In terms of the decks that you could anticipate playing against, there were really sort of 4 top decks at the time. We had Blackwings, which I will be profiling in the near future. We had, obviously, Cat Synchro. That was recently profiled, both in a match and a deck profile. We had Lightsworns, which I will eventually profile. Lightsworns is one of those decks that I don't actually have a lot of the cards in high rarity. It might seem like I do, but I don't have Judgment Dragons or Luminas, so I don't know if I'm going to wait to get those someday or eventually just profile them without them. So I'll eventually talk about Lightsworns, but that's the reason why I haven't profiled them yet. I have profiled before Gladiator Beasts. At this point in time, it's sort of a Chariot, a quest version with only 1 copy of Bestiary. That's a pretty important limitation in terms of GBs. And then the 5th deck is, in fact, the Mirror Match, which only got popular by the end of the format. At the beginning of the format, it was really these 4, especially heading into Nationals. This is what you'd anticipate. The Dark Arm Salvo deck got more popular by the end. It had 3 spots in the top 16 of the last Shonen Jump in Indianapolis, which is a pretty reasonable amount, all things considered, especially when these 4 decks had been so well established. The side deck here is interesting. If you're familiar with Teledad format, there was a game plan during Teledad format where the Teledad player against a deck like, for example, Gladiator Beasts or some of the anti-meta decks had the ability to side into a anti-meta package themselves. And Adam at the Shonen Jump in Indianapolis had a side deck that was very reminiscent of some of the Teledad side decks. So one of the interesting Destiny heroes has always been Destiny Hero Defender. Defender's effect is in and of itself not good. Your opponent gets to basically draw an additional card during their standby phases, which does mean if they attack this on your field in defense position, when it's your turn, as in the turn player who owns this card, that's not when they get the second draw. They get it during their standby phase, so at least you get 1 turn rotation to deal with your own defender. It has 27 defense, and it is a crush card target. It's also a Rhoda target. It's only a level 4. The reason, though, why we have defender is it combines really well with skill drain, right? If we skill drain, now the opponent isn't going to get that additional draw, and they're getting walled by a 2700. A 2700 Destiny draw, Stratos, Allure, crush card target. Hits sort of all of those criteria. So this is a really common package that you would see during Teledad. In addition to that, sometimes you'd see players also put a Zimbriah the Dark in their extra deck, or sorry, in their side deck, because with skill drain, it won't see the reduction in attack when it deals, when it attacks, and it can attack directly and all that. So basically it's just a 2100 Dark Warrior, reinforcements of the army target. Maybe you'd want something like Cyber Dragon instead, but the fact that it's a Dark and it's a Rhoda target and you don't have to always special summon it like Cyber Dragon is one of the reasons why this little package was pretty popular both in this format, out of this extra side deck specifically, but then also back in Teledad format. Because if your opponent has, let's go back to Teledad format for a second, Thunder King Ryos, which was popular started at the latter stage of that format, well, summons Zimbriah, attack, deals with it. In this format, if the opponent goes summon Laquari, you go summon Zabria, attack. That's a pretty good trade-off, right? Your opponent needs to have some type of battle trap there to deal with it. You can go, threaten into Shura. Granted, they could have Kalut, but a 2100 is no joke. It's an attack threshold. That's a term that I've used a lot on this channel. That gets over all the Blackwings before we consider Kalut. It even gets over Sirocco and all of the Gladiator Beast monsters. So it's a pretty big one. It's also enough to attack over a defense position Spy, which is not a joke, right? If you have Skill Drain up and your opponent has Spy, that could really be walling you. That's a big attack, big defense. This attacks right over. So this 6-card package is the Skill Drain package. Adam didn't do this, but I would have if I went back. I would also put the Solemn Judgments in the side deck. He didn't. Instead of the 3 Solemn Judgments, he had a second copy of Mirror of Oaths, a second copy of Dust Tornado, and then a Lightning Vortex. I like Solemn Judgment. If I'm siding into the Skill Drain package, I think having the ability to protect that's really useful. What's cool about Skill Drain is if your opponent goes Cold Wave and you chain Skill Drain, Cold Wave stops cards from being activated, but it doesn't stop continuous effects that are on the field. So if you were to chain Skill Drain to Cold Wave against Cat Synchro, the Skill Drain would still resolve and it would still affect monsters that were summoned, right? Your opponent couldn't then go Monk Double Spell. Skill Drain is still active. So having access to Skill Drain against Cold Wave and then being able to protect it with Judgment, I think would be pretty good. Other cards that have sort of other uses, we have double Legendary Jujutsu Master, which is specifically good against Gladiator Beasts. It's not bad against Blackwings either. They need Kalut to get over this, and that's a little annoying. Right? You go summon Shura. Okay, do I attack? Do I think it's Defender? Do I think it's Tomato? If I do attack and it's Jujutsu Master, the 1800 defense walls, my Shura goes to the top of my deck, which is really annoying. And then I need to summon Shura again, attack, and then I need to Kalut over it. So then I just use the Kalut to deal with this. Granted, I get my Shura effect, but now I've lost my Shura. That's not a great trade. That's not a great trade. So Jujutsu Master is pretty good. Then there's Giant Trunade. If you're siding in the Skill Drains, I think the Giant Trunade makes sense. Right, this deck does need to actually win the game too. We're not relying on Wave Motion Cannon or any other type of burn effects. It's not like Skill Drain is our primary win condition in the sense that once we flip it, we have Beast King Barbaros or Wave Motion Cannon or some way of actually killing the opponent with this on the field. We are also going to be affected by the effect of Skill Drain. Zumbrai is not enough to go the distance. So having Giant Trunade lets us reset Skill Drain when we need it. Maybe summon Dark Arm, summon Salvo, make a play, maybe even kill the opponent, right? This is a time period before hand traps like Effect Veiler or Maxi, so we only really have to worry about Gores, and we can make a big push and then Dark Strike kill them. Having this card in our deck at least gives us an out while we have Skill Drain face up. And then some one-ups. I really like Mind Crush in this format. If your opponent Cold Waves you and you are playing against Cat Synchro, you can call Summoner Monk, which if they're investing in Cold Wave, it probably means they have Monk Double Spell. Sometimes they might have Rescue Cat, and that's a little frustrating, but usually it's Monk Double Spell. So being able to call Monk is really good because then you one-for-one the Monk in their hand, but also strand them, I would say defenseless, but if they used Cold Wave and don't do anything, then they are going to be affected by their own Cold Wave, and maybe you can summon Dark Arm or Black Salvo to go into Black Rose, clear their back rows, and if they Monk Double Spell, their hand is probably 2 spells, Monk, plus the spell and trap removal. Those 2 spells themselves, they can't use them, obviously, if they just used Cold Wave. And those 2 spells have to be really, really, really powerful to actually do anything in combination. And without monsters, assuming you took their 1 Monk, you might not be able to do that. If you go back and watch the match that I just played with Synchro Cat, think about any time that I went for the Monk combo. If my opponent had Mind Crush set, what that would have done to the contents of my hand. Would have really destroyed it. So I really like Mind Crush. You could even warrant main decking it, completely honest. In a deck with Crush Card and Trap Dust Shoot, it's a consideration. And then 1 Dust Tornado and 1 Mirror of Oaths. Mirror of Oaths was good against, was okay against Synchro Cat because you could theoretically stop Monk or Rescue Cat. Not all of the time, honestly, if you're playing that deck in a perfect world, you're clearing the back rows before you actually make that investment. But it is a threat. It's also good against Gladiator Beasts. Obviously, they tag out, you kill it, draw a card, so it has some utility there. Dust Tornado is a really good card against both Black Whirlwind and Royal Oppression, and even to a lesser extent, though depending on how the game progresses, Icarus Attack out of Blackwings. Against Blackwings in this format, in really any format, your primary concern is to deal with Black Whirlwind before they generate too much card advantage, and then also find a way to deal with Icarus Attack. One way is to only set 1 back row and make it so they can never chain Icarus Attack. Right? If you go Summon Shura and they Bottomless, the Blackwing player wants to chain Icarus, pop 2 other cards. Well, if you never give your opponent the ability to do that by setting 3, well, then you've played around Icarus attack. You also can just set chainables. So your opponent Icarus attacks you and you go chain Dust Tornado, chain MST, or chain Dust Tornado, chain Mind Crush, Dust Tornado, chain Dust Shoot, etc. So having a card like Dust Shoot, or rather Dust Tornado, helps you do really what you need to do to actually play against Blackwings and not fall victim to their 2 primary, I would say, win conditions at this point, because with 3 Gales, this deck could beat you through Dark Strike Fighter pretty easily. But 2 of the primary game plans within Blackwings, which is use Icarus attack, not just for a 2/2, but to +1, and then just generate infinite card advantage through Black Whirlwind. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.